So again, my name is Debbie Stein, and I thought I would, given this is a NASA-sponsored event, thought I'd give a little bit about my career using some NASA examples. So I have an engineering degree, which is from UC Irvine, and that was my first encounter with NASA because one of my projects at that point was to do one of the student projects, which was to go on the NASA space shuttle. Then that was a time that the first space shuttles, which this is an indication of how old I am, I and my buddies in engineering school, we went out to the desert to see the first space shuttle land in the dry beds. I see the older group on this side of the room knows exactly what I mean. So it was very exciting. It was like a whole bunch of cars, and we all just sat on my car. I was the only one who had a car, and just kind of watched the space shuttle land. Then I went to Texas, which is where my family is from, and I worked as a field engineer for 5 years and did some of that time for the Air Force. And then I saw the shuttle again. This time, coming back. MBA, basically working full time and sort of getting the MBA at night. I then went to DC. I spent most of my career working in the National Academy of Medicine. I really didn't do too much sort of in the space realm, but I got into sort of policy, politics, things like that, and the sort of interface of those things. But then after that, I went to the Congressional Research Service. Then it was the 50th anniversary of Sputnik. And so when I went there, I said, the first study I'd like to do, the white paper I'd like to do for the Congressional Research Service is look at the implications of the 50th anniversary of Sputnik. And so what I did is I wrote this paper. You can still see it if anybody types Sputnik and Stein, you'll find it online. And I looked and I analyzed the statements made from members of Congress saying, what should the future of NASA be now that we're 50 years out? And it was, a very interesting thing. I had this big long table and all these things. From there, I went to the White House, and I was executive director of PCAS, which is the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. And this is during the first 3 years of President Obama's term. And again, I did not do any space-related studies there, but one of the perks I got, though I did have to use my own dollars to do it, is I got to actually see a space shuttle launch, one of the last space shuttles launched, I think it was the second to last, third to last, from Cape Kennedy, or Cape Canaveral, I can't remember what it's called. I think it's still called Cape Kennedy now. And I was got to be in the VIP area. So I actually got to be in the area like where all the members of Congress and things were, and you could sort of see the space shuttle and actually sort of see it launch. And then I got to come early with my daughter, who is then, I guess, 14 or 15, to actually kind of see the actual launch areas and things like that. So you can imagine as an engineer, this is like the coolest thing for me to do. So I kind of felt at that stage, I had seen it I saw it land at the beginning, I saw it launch at the end. And I looked at that sort of interface with policy. And yet it was also related to sort of the research and all the work and things that I did. After I left the White House, I came to Pittsburgh, and I was a professor in engineering and public policy at Carnegie Mellon. And my goal, as it has been for many years, is sort of translate science engineering to policymakers, and then also to translate policymakers to scientists and engineers. And that's basically what has been the theme of most of my life. It's sort of like my dedicated cause, my sort of thing to try to do things. I'm a generalist, and because I have these sort of wide-ranging issues, I really like to do all sorts of different things. But as I was sort of inspired by these decals around the table, and I thought, oh yes, I remember the day. And when I go back further in time, of course, when I was a kid, I watched the Apollo launches and things like that. I was the one who brought the TV in so we could actually see these things in my school. So education is a big thing. It's a big thing at NASA. A lot of these programs, I would actually look and analyze these when I was at the Congressional Research Service. So everything's sort of related to everything else. So what I would like to do in terms of a beginning is when sort of the pre-task I set in as an introduction was to have you, say like to answer sort of the first question here, which is what your research finding is and a policy implication of your finding. So I'd like to just kind of go around the room and do this, and I want you to do it basically in like one sentence. Okay, one sentence. Because what you learn with policymakers is you gotta be short and you gotta be sweet. Okay, got it? So that was the homework that I sent you guys, and if not, just kind of make it up, or just say pass, because you just can't do it. Oh, thank you. This kind person has a microphone.
It's for the recording.
Yes. Do you want to, can you pass around? Oh, okay.
Don't mind passing it on?
Yes, exactly. Okay, great. Let's start. Say your name, like where you're from, and then give your one sentence. This is so I remember who you are. Yeah,
Okay.
Go ahead.
My name is it on? My name is Kaylin. I'm in the Department of Biology, and I study fruit fly neuroscience. And so I have a preliminary finding, which is that serotonin neurons in the brain are being regulated by their circadian system, which has implications in human health. So,
Okay, why should I care?
Because
I'm a policymaker. Like, why should I care about these fruit flies?
okay, so we have serotonin neurons in our brains, and we have tens of thousands of them. And when things go wrong with the serotonin system, we get neurological disorders like schizophrenia and depression. And so the fruit fly brains, there are only 2 neurons that I study, and so we can use.
Okay, too much information. All I needed was schizophrenia and something else. Okay, great. Next. Okay. Thank you.
My name's Sheena Murphy. I'm an Associate Vice President for Research Development here and also a faculty member in physics. In that capacity as AVPR, I frequently have to go to talk to policymakers about research that's done at the university. So I'm going to take a stab at promoting. We're here to promote artificial intelligence at the university. We think that this is an area that is of acute need for our students. It's extremely important in contemporary research, and as well, it's an avenue for economic development for the state of West Virginia.
Okay, so all I needed was economic development. Good. Yes, next.
Hi, I'm Christopher Rustinello. I study groundwater. And in particular, I'm studying how waves in bays and coastal oceans drive surface water into and out of the sandy seabed, and about 40% more, or 40 times more water than all rivers combined in a given year. And that exchange of water and chemicals has important and really uncharacterized implications for health of coastal ecosystems.
Okay, but why should I care?
Because we want to swim there, we want to fish there, we want to not go into the ocean and die as we enter the water.
Okay, good. There we go. Yes, next.
Hi, my name is Jen Gallagher. I'm in the Department of Biology, and we are working on trying to understand how genetic variation affects stress response. So we're all exposed to chemicals, but you react to a chemical probably differently than I do, and that in part is based on the differences in your genes.
Okay, so again, why should I care?
Because you don't want to die.
Okay, but everybody's going to die, right?
Well, this is implications for therapeutic drugs. So
okay, I don't know what a therapeutic drug is.
Drugs to treat your cancer.
Okay, so I only
personalized
care about this
medicine.
if I get cancer.
Most people will get something in their life: diabetes, high blood pressure, exposed to herbicides in your food,
okay, good.
chemicals in your water.
Good. Next.
My name's Rachel. I'm a first-year PhD student in the geology department, and I'm looking at the water quality impacts of energy development here in West Virginia. And this is important because drinking water quality is already impaired in many regions of West Virginia due to legacy coal mining and oil and gas drilling. So it's important to understand how our rapidly expanding hydraulic fracturing and new drilling aspects are affecting current water quality.
Okay, well, good. Understand that. Let's go back here. Thank you.
I'm Cole von der Haar. I'm an assistant professor over in psychology, and I work in animal models of traumatic brain injury. And I guess the big picture thing I'd like to convey is that Traumatic brain injury is a significant risk factor for almost every single neurological disease and psychiatric disorder, and yet there are no existing treatments for this.
Okay, I need more. In other words, I don't, it's like way too jargony for me.
Okay.
So relate that to your everyday person. Say you're speaking to some sixth graders. What would I care about?
So
Like what are they doing that might cause them some sort of injury?
yeah, so brain injuries are extremely common across the population. Almost 1 in 4 people will experience one across their lifetime.
Okay, but how? How would I get a brain injury?
A variety of mechanisms: car crashes, football, falling, impacts to the head.
Yeah, so now you're getting towards like real people talk. Okay, great, next.
My name is Katie Kessner. I'm an assistant professor also in psychology.
Can you talk a little louder?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Okay, that's good to know. Okay, so programs to support K through 12 teachers will improve educational outcomes and have positive effects on the West Virginia economy.
Okay, that was like way too vague for me. So can you be more specific?
Trying to be people talk.
Yeah, real people talk. Yeah.
Programs that support K through 12 teachers and evidence-based practices will improve student outcomes.
Okay, more specificity. Okay, so it's evidence-based on what? Like
Teaching and
what is it?
classroom
Like you say you're
management.
talking to a group of
Okay.
teachers.
Yeah.
What should they do differently than they're doing now, maybe?
Use evidence-based practices for classroom management and
Okay, so evidence-based
teaching.
practice is jargon. So name one evidence-based practice.
high student engagement.
What is high student engagement? What does that mean? That's jargon too.
Teachers should get their students highly involved in practicing what they're learning.
Okay. Still, we're going to move on.
Okay.
Okay, but you need one example. Okay, one example that whatever it is that you're talking about. Because honestly, I have no idea what you're talking about. And I'm really trying, and I've done a lot of stuff on student stuff. Okay, go ahead.
I'm Catherine Blackwood. I'm a graduate student in biomedical science. So my research focuses on vaccine development, and the vaccine that I'm making specifically would help people that have burn wounds. So people like the military or firefighters or cooks and chefs.
Good. Okay. Want to try? Do you have an example yet? No. Okay. Okay. Let's try the elder set over here to see how they do. Okay.
Hi, my name is Hanna Szczepanowska, and I work for the School of Art and Design. I work with preservation, teach technical art history, which is sort of spreading on technical aspect of cultural heritage. And I work with space heritage. And my appeal to the policymaker would be to preserve space heritage because it serves primary material for study of towards new space explorations. And that was evidenced when the Orion mission was already studying one successful example of re-entry through the atmosphere in Apollo heat shield.
Okay. Yeah. So the only thing I would say is that when you say space, space has many meanings. So first, particularly when we talk about art and space.
Space heritage.
Yeah, I was thinking about like space as in like architectural space or, but you really meant outer space, right?
Above entry, above. Sort of,
Yeah.
yes.
Another, yeah.
Above Leo.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So yeah, but I do think it's important because literally, because particularly since you're from an art school, I really initially thought you were talking about things that were not outer space. It wasn't until like about halfway through and you started talking about like actual space vehicles that I got what you were talking about. So somewhere I would just throw outer space in there as opposed to just space or some sort of space.
Right. It's not exactly outer space. It's the concept is to work with material which had a successful re-entry through the atmosphere, so through Leo really.
Yeah.
And there are not many of them.
Yeah, but
available.
there's some, I can't remember the name of it, but there is something for that part of space, right? You know, the near Earth or something like that, near Earth space. I can't remember exactly. But anyhow, I would just kind of just do something in there to make it clear that that's the part that you're talking about. But I think for most people, outer space would work.
Okay.
Something that doesn't make people think you're thinking about art space or architectural space is a thing. Yeah. Okay. Next.
I'm just observing.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Micah Gregory. I'm a project coordinator at the West Virginia Prevention Research Center at the School of Public Health. I guess the research finding that I would want to share is the importance of a child's social environment, his family, his friends, his school, what he does after school, he or she does after school, is important in predicting their involvement in potential risky behaviors such as substance abuse throughout their life, including up to their adult life.
Okay. So I think people would say, I know that already. Like if my kid hangs with a bad group of kids, that's bad. And if it's a good group of kids, it's good. So what are you doing that's different than what seems obvious? Like what would you tell, like if you're talking to a group of parents at an after school event, what would you tell them to do differently than what they're doing now?
So a lot of what we are trying to do is assess and evaluate cohorts of kids in schools, in entire classrooms, and using the activities that are being used and how basically assessing what the kids' perceptions are to predict whether or not they're at risk for certain kinds of behaviors.
Okay, so it's still a little bit too jargony. Okay, so try to like, get it down to something like certain kinds of behaviors, like, like this will lead to this. Okay, like if your kid does A, then they're going to become a drug addict or something, or I realize that's an extreme, but something that people can understand, because otherwise you're using a lot of jargon terms that doesn't make it, that doesn't make me care.
So one example is talking about access to healthy foods, access to food, or in other words, food security, on how that can create stress in children as they grow up. And that stress can be carried with them throughout adulthood and lead them to seek things like substance abuse to relieve their stress or be distractions. So just one example.
See, much better, because that is something that would be relevant to a policymaker, because that is relevant to food programs. Do you see? So it's a big difference just between those two things, because the first thing had absolutely no relevance to me. The second one, as a policymaker, does. Right? Okay. Yeah. Next.
My name is Sue Workman, and I work with the West Virginia Prevention Research Center. And we were looking at a project that looked at the number of minutes of physical activity a child receives each day. And some of the background as to why we're doing this is because West Virginia is one of the highest obesity states, and that only a little more than 20% of the children get the national standard of 60 minutes of activity per day. So looked statewide to see that for physical activity in the schools, a little over 70% met that qualification, and for physical education, a little over 98% met that qualification. But it's important to note that lack of time and facilities and limited staff were reasons noted as barriers to meeting these recommendations.
So that's like too many numbers and too little bottom line. So if you had one sentence to tell a policymaker what should be different based on this work, what should be different in terms they can understand?
That more staffing, time and facilities are needed for the teachers to be able to implement physical activity and physical
So by
education.
more staffing, do you mean more people on the playground? Or what does more staffing actually mean?
It could mean on the playground. A lot of times it means that there's lack of physical education teachers, and they're not meeting that requirement because they're not in the building able to teach that particular class.
Okay, yeah. So what I would do is, get very specific, right? So right now there's like 5 teachers per school, and in order to meet this time requirement that doctors recommend, there should be 8. and because that's something that people can understand. So try to keep it very, sort of specific in terms of what it is, because the data you're giving, you have a lot of data, but it's very general, right? But get it down to like per school or per something, so that people can say, okay, well, so how much would, then I as a policymaker say, oh, how much would it cost to add, say, one phys ed teacher per school? And that's not a hard question to answer, right? And then we can figure out how many schools are there in West Virginia, and that's something I can say, well, can we afford that? Can we not afford that? Yeah, okay, yes.
Hi, my name is Emily Gardner. I'm an assistant professor in civil and environmental engineering. And a finding of one of my studies is that changes to drinking water chemistry can sometimes lead to the growth of bacteria. The one that I'm focusing on in particular is Legionella, and it causes a type of pneumonia in drinking water distribution systems. And so that's important because we want people to have access to safe, clean drinking water that doesn't lead to the development of disease.
Okay, so I understand I'm supposed to care about drinking water, but does that mean I have a problem today? In other words, like, should I be worried about the water I was just drinking?
That's a difficult question to answer, but I would say no, you
Okay.
shouldn't necessarily, but we want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to keep that water safe. And
Okay, so if I'm a policymaker, what, if anything, should I be doing differently?
investing in more research to make sure we have safe drinking water.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so you want me to give more money to you? That's what you're asking for, right? I just want
so
to
that I
clarify
can
this.
help make sure we're all safe and healthy.
But you're not really testing my drinking water, right? You're just doing testing, right? You're just doing
but
research.
that testing informs, regulatory policy to make sure that we all benefit.
Okay, yeah. Okay, great.
So I'm Melanie Page, also in the research office. My portfolio is the arts, social sciences, and humanities. And I didn't think I had to do this. But colleague Sheena set the bar. So when I talk to policymakers, I'm actually very uncomfortable asking for money, which I'm usually going and asking for money. So I'm interested to sort of learn how to do that better. But I try to tie everything back to economic development for the state. And I found like policymakers are less concerned about death, dying, and health, and are most concerned about economic development. So that's just been my experience. So I try to tie everything back to that.
At first, I thought I should say pass. But when it comes to communications, well, first of all, I wear two hats. One is professor of engineering, and my research area is design of experiments, and that's a different thing. But the reason why I'm here is because I run a NASA program with the help of a number of people such as Melanie. And when it comes to talking to politicians, every time I talk to them, I want their money. I mean, you said, do you want my money? Yes, I do want their money. And my job, or our job, our group, is to make sure that we do good work in the state of West Virginia and communicate the effect of what we do to our policymakers in Washington, D.C. and say, this is the reason why NASA is important. This is the reason why you should fund our programs. And we should communicate to the people, to our constituents in the state of West Virginia, why NASA exists, why whatever NASA does affects your daily life. So we communicate with the constituents about why NASA is important, and then we're going to talk to our politicians about funding our programs so that we can continue with doing that.
Yeah, so what I would say is that, yes, that is true, right? I mean, that's part of the reason why you talk to them, but, you can also do things to help them, right? So it's not just a one-way street. So that when you knock on their door, the only time you knock on their door is when you want money, right? You need to also knock on the door and say, hey, here's some information that might be useful for you in something that you care about.
That's a true statement. That's why, seriously, we are always, I communicate, or my group, my friends, my colleagues, we communicate with our folks in Washington, D.C. so many times a year. And, they know me now after all these times. So anytime there's a good news about the launch of a payload that we have done, they know about it, and they make, and it makes them proud that kids in West Virginia have launched something into space. So it's not like every time that I mean, in February, March, when they're talking about budgets, we go there.
Well, no, it's good, but I think it's just, I mean, I'll give you an example from my work. So one of the things that I did when I was at Carnegie Mellon, I ran a competition funded by the Department of Energy, which was, it was a clean tech competition. And so students from 4 states, including West Virginia, could compete and win a $50,000 prize. So it was West Virginia, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. One of the student teams was something called Gecko Robotics, which is just a company that it's a robot that kind of crawls inside like boilers and things like that, finds stress levels, and it saves energy and environment and lives because people don't fall off scaffolding and all these other kinds of things. So when I was working with this company, and I was sort of helping them, coach them at the time, you know, there was 3 people, right? I'm doing some other work, and I contacted them to see if they would take in some folks from underrepresented groups that I'm trying to link to robotics companies. And I said, well, how you guys doing? Hey, we have 100 people that we are now employing in Pittsburgh. Well, that's amazing. In less than 5 years, going from 3 people to 100 people that they're employing. So the first thing I did was write a note to the funder of the organization I work for, Carnegie Mellon, even though I don't work for Carnegie Mellon anymore, and said, guess what? This organization that because the institute I was working for was funded by RK Mellon, which is one of the big foundations in the region, that you helped establish, has now created 100 jobs in the region, because I knew that RK Mellon, the foundation, cared about those 100 jobs. And as soon as I get a spare moment, I'm going to send a note to DOE and say, guess what? 100 jobs were created by this one little company that was just 3 people 5 years ago, all through this like competition. And by the way, another company, which is called Robotany, just created 25, it already has 25 jobs, just got a big investment, probably will double or triple in 4 years. I mean, this is only 4 years later, right? And it is headquartered in one of the down and out areas of Pittsburgh, right? So I'm going to call them whenever there is good news like that, because just as Melanie's talking about, economic development is a big thing, right? Now, they might not care about it like immediately, but having those little anecdotes, those little stories, things like that, make a big difference, you know, because they need to know that what you're doing has an impact, right? Beyond just getting a paper published and increasing the prestige. And it's more than more money for us, right? So it's always just good to keep on those relationships so that when you do knock on their door every single year, try to, you know, to say, we need money, more money, that, you know, you are showing some impact, right? Even though it's hard, and having that, and sometimes that might be communicating your work to the public, right? It might not be job creation, but it might be showing something like, okay, well, like we were talking about schools or things like that. Oh, we went and we talked to these things, and this such and such happened. This school decided to increase, like to hire an extra PE teacher or something, right? So it's still having impact on the community, even if it's not necessarily job creation. So that's just like a little thing to sort of keep in mind. So any questions before I move on to like all these other things that we're going to be doing? Okay, so let's go forward on. So this is what you're supposed to get a better understanding of, how government works. We just kind of talked a little bit about that. Optimal modes of engagement, relationship building, we kind of talked a bit about that. What a policymaker needs to know for your research to be useful, and common mistakes research makes. So kind of going through all your different research activities, you got a bit of an overview of this. This is what we just did. Okay, so here is something that's like a very important thing, which is, who is a policymaker you want to influence? Okay, so one thing you have to think about is your issue something your policymaker can influence, And does the issue relate to your policymaker's goals? So anybody want to share like a policymaker they think they might want to influence? Come on, somebody's got to know somebody. Yes. Okay, that's good. Okay, do you know what part of the Appropriations Committee you're on? Okay, so the Appropriations Committee is, there's two kinds of committees in Congress. I'm not talking about West Virginia legislature, which I'm still trying to understand. This is for another project I'm working on. But so I'm going to talk really federal level because that's what I know. So there's something called Authorization Committees. And that Authorization Committees are, say, the House Science Committee. And they're the ones who approve that there can be a certain kind of organization. You know? So for example, say for the National Science Foundation, if they think there should be a program on, a certain program on education related activities, for example, it is authorized. Just because something is authorized does not mean it will ever be funded, okay? The Appropriations Committee is the one who decides each year whether or not it will be funded. So it can be very deceiving because you'll see like in some newsletter or something in the press that says, oh, you know, the Congress has just authorized a new program at the National Science Foundation that for early career scientists to get more money. But if the Appropriation Committee never funds that program, it never really happens. And that happens a lot, okay? Now, the challenge with the Appropriations Committee is that there's, let me see if I'm right, 13 appropriation committees, maybe it's 9, can't remember, something on that order. And what you want to know is for the West Virginia senators, which one are they on? Because if they're on something that affects, I don't know, say railroads, and not something that affects your area of research, then it's not going to help you. Because it's all related to jurisdiction. Yes?
Your proof is that the members of the CJS.
Okay, well, good.
And both of them. Like, I know that because CJS funds appropriate funding for NASA.
Right. Okay.
And of course, justice.
Right. Yeah. So, so one of the main, but not the only committee, the one he's talking about is the Commerce, Justice, and Science Committee, and that's where he's saying the 2 West Virginia senators are at. Now that works well, but it doesn't cover everything. You know, so for example, I don't believe, for example, Health and Human Services is under CJS. It's not. Our energy is under Energy and Water Appropriations Committee, right? So it's good to. I'm sorry.
I think Senator Manchin is part of
And okay, Senator Manchin is part of Energy and Water also. Yeah, he's been around for a while, so that all gives seniority. So you want to know what Appropriations Committee they are for, but it's always good to have something in appropriations. But remember, it's only the Senate, not the House. Yes.
Just an FYI that we have a really excellent federal relations person, Suzanne Bensel, every time see I recommend first,
Yeah, so it's good, and it's a good point that if you are in DC for other business, maybe you're there for a review committee or something like that, and you'd like to talk to somebody, like in an agency even, you know, or a congressional staffer or something like that, and you think you have something worthwhile to say, what I'm going to give you today will help you prep for something like that. But yeah, you do need to work with your federal relations person. But generally, they do like to hear from constituents. Another thing to keep in mind is sometimes the best time to talk to everybody is like back when they're in the home district. It's a lot easier to get an appointment than in DC. Okay, anybody else want to do that? So the main thing I want you to learn here is that jurisdiction is important. You can't just pick somebody at random. You really need to think about the issue, whether or not they are able to have any influence. If they're not on the right committee, then they really can't do very much to help you. So you need to really target the right person. Okay, so this is sort of the next task. We're going to spend a few minutes of this. So we kind of talked about this a bit. I call this the what actions, if any, question. So the key is, what actions, if any, should a policymaker take to respond to concerns about whatever problem it is that you're trying to solve? And the reason, I'm going to give an example here. So I did this, I got invited up to Canada, I don't know, about 4 or 5 years ago. And I want to give this as an example to show you how you should form your question. So here we have, what actions, if any? Now, the if any is because the most common action when you're looking at any sort of policy activity is no action. Does anybody want to have a guess at how many bills, what percentage of bills pass Congress each year? Well, I mean, pass as in make it to the president's desk. Yes. Yes. That is correct. 1%. Okay? That's how hard it is to get to the president's desk. Now, many bills are introduced, few are passed. Okay? So you always have to keep that in mind, that the status quo is the most common result. So that's the person winning. So then the second question is, Alberta's, in this case I'm using Canada, Alberta's Minister of Environment and Sustainable Resource Development. So here what you want to do is you want to pinpoint who is the actual person to take the action, right? Because remember, Congress is not the implementer per se, right? All Congress does is say, EPA, you should do that, or Department of Energy, you should do that, or NASA, you should do that, right? And you want to be as specific as possible because these agencies are very big, right? So think about who you want to do. So the next thing is, say, companies, in this case. So like in this case, we're talking about, reducing emissions and so forth. Well, because it said like cars, right? Cars emit greenhouse gas emissions. There's many sources of greenhouse gas emissions. So in this particular case, this policy is focusing on companies. And then we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions as opposed to, say, I don't know, just general air pollution emissions, water emissions, whatever it might be. And we're talking about oil sands, because there's, of course, again, many sources. And we're talking about Canada, right? And actually, we're really talking about Alberta, Canada. Okay. So I want everybody to just spend just like, let me see here, 3 minutes writing down your what actions, if any, question. Yeah, so this is if you were if you were trying to, you're kind of setting up your policy analysis is what you're doing, right? So what you should be doing is saying, like, what actions, if any, should be taken by, let's just say that we had somebody who was like water stuff, right? Should be taken by the West Virginia Department of Natural Resources, whoever it does water stuff here, to encourage them to not use this chemical in the wastewater treatment. No. What you're supposed to do is just determine the question. Because it turns out that determining the question is not an easy thing. Yes. That helped? Do you want another couple of minutes now that I've clarified it further? Yeah. Because you it's sort of like, let me put it this way. When you do research, right, the first thing is determining what question you're answering, right? You kind of like, it's almost like, you're almost like setting up your hypothesis question. So that your first part is developing this policy neutral question. You're not assuming what the policy should be. You're just trying to say, okay, well, my research finding is leaning toward this. I'm trying to figure out what action, if any, that the policymaker, I should maybe suggest to the policymaker. Is that clear? Might be clear as we go further. Okay, anybody need more time? No? Okay. Who wants to volunteer? Yes, go ahead.
Dry season water availability across the Iron Mountain West.
Okay. So constructing beaver dams is the answer, but it's not the question. Okay. So what is the purpose of constructing the beaver dams?
There are several reasons: to raise the water table, to increase growth of native vegetation, to reduce erosion of rivers by slowing down the flow, and to possibly increase dry season water availability.
Okay, so what you really want to say is probably is that let's just take water availability just as one thing. So it's like what actions, if any, should be taken by BLM, Bureau of Land Management, to increase water availability. Okay, so when we get to options, which will be next, your first option is the status quo, which is whatever the current policy is. The second option is funding beaver dams, and the third option will be something else. Okay, so this is a very common thing that happens, and this is why the question is important. Is you don't want to put the answer in the question, right? You're not trying to figure out how to implement something that you've already pre-decided. Instead, what you're trying to do is look at that option from a policymaker perspective. So imagine, I'm the policymaker. So you're analyzing for me, and I'm trying to figure out, okay, right now we're like, I don't know, let's just say we're having somebody inspect all the beaver dams and making sure they stay up, okay? You're coming to me and saying we should build more beaver dams, okay? And somebody else totally different is coming and saying, oh no, what we should do is do artificial dams, like from the Army Corps of Engineers. I'm the policymaker, I have to decide which of these to do, okay? So that's why you're doing the analysis. So when you talk to the policymaker, you can answer their questions, okay? So, I mean, it's a good example because like I said, it's a very common thing to do is to put your answer in the question. Okay, anybody else? Somebody else is gonna be brave. Yes.
Mine's kind of big. Oh, thanks. What actions, if any, should be taken by the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection to encourage oil and gas drilling companies to implement best practices that will minimize the risk of drinking water contamination?
Okay, so you were close there. Okay, but take out to use best practices. Okay, because best practices is again the option in the question.
So just to encourage oil and gas drilling companies to minimize the risk of drinking water contamination?
Right. Okay, so best practices is one option, right? But somebody else would say, and this actually is an issue I spent a lot of time working on, okay? So somebody else might say, okay, well, that's voluntary. I think it should be regulatory, okay? So one option is status quo, what it is now, which is basically voluntary, like people can do it. I mean, nothing's preventing them from doing it. Another way is to take steps to encourage them. So it's still voluntary, but maybe they'll get a financial incentive or do something related to permits. I did 3 days at a Nature Conservancy workshop just on this topic, okay? So I spent a lot of time on this issue, right? A third way, which some people would certainly advocate, is to regulate, right? And so from a policymaker standpoint, those are three different issues, the three different options that I'm looking at. Okay. How about this side, the elder side? Yes.
To encourage school personnel to increase PE and PA minutes during the school day.
Okay. So the same thing in that increasing the minutes is the answer, right? What you really want is then the ultimate goal is to increase their activity. one way of doing that is to increase PE minutes. But another way might be to, I don't know, increase after-school programs. Okay.
What actions, if any, should be taken by the West Virginia Department of Education to encourage school personnel to increase PE/PA minutes during the school day, but it should be changed to increase activity during the school day,
Yes. Well,
right?
well, I would maybe even say during school day. Maybe I would just say to increase the activity of the school age population or something. Because, so I could see somebody might say, because that's really what you care about, right, is that population. So like somebody might say, okay, well, maybe one way is to increase the number of PE teachers and PE time, right? And then there might be an after school group that might say, okay, well, instead we should increase the availability of sports or increase intramural sports. Like I hear that an awful lot, that rather than increasing like sports where, like only a certain number of people get in, we should be spending more on intramural sports where everybody can get in. There's no restrictions based on how good you are at football or something, right? So there are other options that could be considered that might be less expensive than, say, paying a PE teacher. And so somebody, I'm sure there's probably a variety of people coming at ideas. Because remember, you're not the only one coming to the policymaker with those ideas. And so you want to look at a variety of ideas, still reaching the same goal. So the idea, when you're talking about, say, in this case, say, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, that's the goal. That's the societal goal that you're trying to reach. And there are many ways of reaching that goal. And one of the ways that you can do is the one related to your research, probably, but there are also other ways to reach that same goal, which might be related to your research or somebody else's research. Okay, anybody else? Otherwise, we'll move on. Sure.
What, if any, action should be taken in case of a new landing on the moon to protect heritage, space heritage on the moon and alt landing areas?
Okay, I'm sorry again. What?
What, if any, action should be taken in case of a new landing on the moon?
Oh, new landing on the moon.
To preserve space heritage, which already exists there.
Okay, well, I think the challenge with that is that it presumes that the space heritage should be preserved.
I think there are many assumptions. One of them is who actually owns the area, which is
yes, yeah.
But it's just a question.
Yeah. No, I mean that's why the questions are hard, right? It's because not everybody would agree. Because like you just said, the moon is really, you can't say it's necessarily the United States has responsibility just because it's probably their stuff on the moon. And now we know other people are landing on the moon or trying to land on the moon, including both private as well as other countries, right? So whose responsibility is? So one option would be to have a treaty, right? Like there's plenty of space, there's plenty of treaties like about junk in space and things like that. So one policy option might be to have one of these UN treaties that focus on preservation of, artifacts on the moon. That would be like one of my policy options.
Landing sites in particular.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that would all have to be worked out in the UN, and they do all that mumbo jumbo. But there's quite a bit of things related to space, right? There's international policy related to that. So, okay, let's continue on. So you had the question. Okay, so the next thing is to come up with the policy option. So we sort of talked about that all already. So there's all sorts of things that policymakers do. So most people think that all policymakers do is tax and regulate. But actually, policymakers do a lot more than this. This is examples. Some of these, like grants to like research universities or subsidies like for electric cars. Sometimes there's things, agency budgets, like we just talked about for NASA. So there's all sorts of things that policymakers do beyond just taxes and regulation. And then there's other things too. I thought this is from a publication that just came out in the past year or so. I think it's a pretty good thing. So when you go to a policymaker, you want to know, what is it you're exactly asking me to do, right? So sometimes it does make a difference if they're on Appropriations Committee if you're asking for money. But you can also ask them for other things. Like, for example, that first one, writing letters to agency heads. I've asked that a lot of times, right? Does it really mean something if you're head of an agency and you ask a member of Congress to write something to the head of the agency about an issue or problem or whatever it might be? Because that's something, particularly if it's something that the agency really can do something about. Now that letter will have more impact if your member of Congress is on an authorization or appropriation committee related to that agency, but it's also not a zero impact because they never know where that member of Congress will end up. Like maybe they're not on the authorization committee this session, but maybe they'll be on it the next session. So it's in their best interest for them to do it. Or ask for a briefing from agency staff. So say if there is a Department of Education policy that says restricting, that makes it hard to increase PE time, then, you know, and then yes, it's perfectly fine to say, okay, let's get a briefing from the agency staff and try to make your case to the agency staff. It might be hard for you to do it, but if the member of Congress sends a letter to the agency and says, hey, we think that there's a problem here, I would like you to meet with these constituents, then they'll probably meet with the constituents, right? So don't limit yourself when you're thinking about all these different activities. This publication, by the way, is free online, the full text. And it's something that the way that they did this, and the link here is here in my thing here, or you can just Google it. And the way that they came up with what's in this guide is they surveyed people like me who spent a lot of time working with policymakers and said, what would you tell people to do? And that's how they came up with the recommended practices. Yes?
We have like kind of a fine line too, because we kind of have a fine line where we're not really allowed to advocate.
Mm-hmm.
So we're more to inform.
Mm-hmm.
So do you have any suggestions on that piece?
Yeah, so it's really like not this is a common, you know, issue. When you're advocating, you're trying to get something like for yourself, right? So if you're trying to get more money for your personal research at West Virginia University, then you are advocating for yourself. But when you're advocating, when you're saying trying to get more money for NASA overall, which may or may not ever come to West Virginia University, then that's different, okay? Or if you're trying to inform public policy, again, you know, like about PE time, that's not advocacy either, right? Because it's not like it's going to benefit you personally. You know, like unless you have some big investment in, I don't know, the PE teachers union or something, I don't know, that's not advocacy, right? So, I mean, it is, you know, you do have to be careful, and I'll talk a little bit about this later when we get to the sort of communication part of this. But, you know, you really, you're just informing, and you just have to make sure that you're talking based on facts and not an analysis and not on personal opinion.
Sort of follow-up question to that. So what if you're presenting facts and you're recommending a particular policy, but you're going to benefit by that policy as a side effect? Like, is that advocacy? So like the specific example I was looking at here was actually looking at school start times for high school students.
Mm-hmm.
So the research is very clear that it should be 8:30 to 9 o'clock, right? California just passed a bill.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say, okay, well, in general, if I advocated for that, it's so that students do better, right? Society does better. But I also personally have a high school student right now.
Mm-hmm.
So I would have skin in the game in putting this forward? Like, is that advocacy or?
No, yeah. So I think it's, when I was at National Academy of Sciences, there's one thing that that is always important to separate. And one is bias, and one is conflicts of interest, okay? So everybody has biases, right? Like, let's just take something like K through 12, which is a really good example. We all have biases based on how we grew up, where we grew up. Same thing with grammar, okay? Yeah, I grew up in Texas. I learned a different way of speaking than these people up Northeast, okay? And so we all have biases, and we just need to acknowledge our biases, right? But conflicts of interest are when really I would financially benefit in some way. So I'm going and say I had this happen one time. So there's a major person. She was head of a major research lab. I was working on a study that was about a program that provided support for that research lab. She didn't tell me that until like really late in the process. And we had to tell her, sorry, you can't be on the committee, right? Now she herself wasn't benefiting, right? It wasn't like she personally got money, but the institution that she was heading did get money. And so it might affect the future of the program, right? So it really isn't, it's not really related. The only time you really get in trouble is when it's related to money. That's why I was saying an investment in the janitor, what was it? No, the PE teachers union, right? Because money, I mean, even I don't care if it's $5 or it's $50 or $5,000. Any little bit of money can make a difference. You know, you make a $5 donation to a presidential campaign, that's enough. You know, for you to be considered to be biased or in conflict of interest and things like that. So sure, you might think, oh yeah, I get more, you know, my daughter gets more sleep. I'm benefiting, but it's not a financial benefit. Yeah.
Related to that, where do you see the line between communicating science and activism? Because this is something that I've seen a lot, I think, in environmental fields where, you know, someone's working on science and it becomes so clear to them that something is the way we should, you know, handle a situation. Climate science is a good example of this. A lot of climate scientists have gotten to a point where they're speaking out, and now people consider them to be activists, and they say, I can no longer trust what this person is saying because they're not an impartial scientist, they're an activist. And it's something I struggle a lot with, you know. Yeah. So just
yeah, and there's a really good book, and I can't remember the name of it, but it's by someone Roger Pilkey, P-I-E-L-K-E, University of Colorado. And in one of the papers I wrote when I was at Congressional Research Service, I used this, and I use it in a lot of my talks, but I did not put it in this talk. And it talks about the different kinds of scientists. And I'm somebody who believes strongly that you should be neutral, okay? Some people believe I'm so neutral that means that I don't care about an issue or whatever it is, because let's say climate change, because I've done many studies on climate change. But for me, it's important to keep that impartiality on an issue like climate change. So even though I have like been a study director talking about all the things that need to be done about climate change, I would not be an activist for that reason. Other people feel like you were just talking about, you know, that it's more important to be active on the issue than it is to maintain that neutral status. It really is up to you what you decide to do, but you just need to know that perception of you will change. And you will be considered in the policy community, you will be considered to be biased. And even some of the scientists who do try to stick with the facts and so forth still have challenges. And I've worked with many of these climate scientists because my very first study was on the National Academies. It was called Policymakers of Greenhouse Warming. And so I've worked with a lot of major people in the field. And I remember one of the most well-known was a guy named Steve Snyder. And he was a great communicator on climate change, and he just got hung out to dry. And it was just a big challenge, you know, for him. But other people, they stay neutral. They're still, sort of in the game. Yeah.
So what are the actions that move you from neutral scientists to activists? Is it like raising money? Is it raising awareness?
It's really the sort of the way you speak and speaking beyond your own personal expertise. And that, I think, is really the key. In other words, you go beyond your own personal research and you start talking about the broader view. Like, I think you'll see a lot of people who, scientists who are active on climate change, are not really climate scientists themselves. They're reading the work of climate scientists and then saying we should do something about it.
Hang on just one second.
Can you discuss that point more directly, especially what is my research? So if I am a groundwater researcher and I am talking about the effects of climate change on groundwater, can I only talk about my individual studies, the things that I've actually put my name on and published, or can I talk about how climate change will affect groundwater and other studies that I understand very well?
You can always talk about the impact.
Sure.
Okay. But the question is, how far do you lean into policy? Okay. So if you go and you say, okay, well, here's study A, B, C that talks about all the impacts on groundwater. That is perfectly fine. All peer-reviewed research, so on and so forth, right? But when you then say, because of studies A, B, and C, we should ban hydraulic fracturing from every state in the union, that's advocacy.
Okay. So instead I should say, if hydraulic fracturing continues, these papers say that this is the likely outcome, or something like that.
Yes.
Okay.
Because what the challenge with this is, and again, this is kind of more in the communication section we haven't gotten to yet, is it's putting too much certainty on the science. And we all know science is not certain, right? And, even everything has ranges. And things can intervene, things can happen. So, you can say, another thing is, like when I was at the Congressional Research Service, we were only allowed to present policy options, not policy recommendations. So that's what I always encourage people to do. And that's why when we're talking about here, in this case, policy options, you need to give more than just one, right? You need to show a variety of different things that could be done and not necessarily pick one, because you guys are not experts in policy analysis. But on the other hand, I also don't think it's a good idea to say action should be taken without doing policy analysis, because that's not right either. Yes?
I wouldn't necessarily want to give the full spectrum of options, because I might like some of those options.
Well, that's why when we're going to talk about, which I guess we should move on because otherwise we're running out of time, I'm going to talk to you how to prioritize those options. So I'm not saying it's impossible, because literally there are hundreds of variations of options, right? But you can say, well, I've looked at a variety of different options. These couples seem to make the most sense to me. But when you start picking one and really advocate for that one, then you move into advocacy. Now, when it comes to research funding, okay, everybody here is biased for more research funding, and people know it, right? So it's a little bit different. In fact, when I was at CRS, that was one of the challenges I had in my interview. They were worried I would be too biased for research funding. And I had to show that I was able to write a list of 10 reasons why research should not be funded.
Not be funded.
Yes, that it was possible for me to do that, because I had just done a major study at the National Academies saying how important it was to fund research, and doing all this analysis saying why. And they want to know, could I write the opposite? There you go. So I can tell you 10 reasons. So
I don't want to hear.
okay. Let me see. Okay, well, I would like you to at least write down, just as part of your exercise, let me go do this one too. Just write down 2 or 3 bullets, what it is that you would think about doing for this exercise before we move on, because otherwise we can't do the rest of the activity. Just remember, no more than 2 is needed. Yes?
Can you reiterate what is the exercise we're supposed to do?
Okay, so you have your question. So you're sort of what actions, if any, question. And you're going to be analyzing three policy options. Okay, policy option 1, done, status quo. Nothing changes, whatever the current policies are. Then you have 2 alternative options. For most of you, that should be pretty easy because you already had a policy option in your question, in the original version of your question. So it was more PE teachers, for example, okay? So that's option 2. You only need a few words, you don't need to do anything fancy, okay? So then you come up with a third option. And the third option can't be something like wild and crazy. It has to be something reasonable. So think about a colleague. Okay, so like say you were at some meeting and it was a meeting of like all the PE teachers, or not PE teachers, let's say all the principals. And the principal said, okay, well, yes, we know we need more exercise time for the kids, but I don't think we need more PE teachers. We need more X. What would they say? What would those stakeholders say? That should be your third option. Because it's that group that the policymaker is most likely to hear from. Okay, so I don't need a lot. I just need just a few words. Does that make sense? Okay, so here's an example from one of my students when I was at Carnegie Mellon. So she was actually from South Africa. And here's her what actions, if any, question, which is, what actions, if any, should be taken to mitigate the potential impacts of freshwater withdrawals in the Karoo region of South Africa? This is a region that is being considered for hydraulic fracturing. Notice, by the way, I said hydraulic fracturing, not fracking, because fracking is jargon, an informal term. Try to stay neutral in your language. One was to implement the existing draft regulations that they had in South Africa. One is to mandate the use of acid mine drainage for hydraulic fracturing. And another was to expand the role of the Department of Water Affairs to include constant monitoring and public updating of water withdrawal rates. So I think this gives a pretty good example, you know, where one is something that's, you know, going to be particularly challenging, and another is something where it's less expensive, but might reach the same goal of trying to reduce freshwater impacts. And you can imagine in South Africa, water is a big deal, right? And with hydraulic fracturing, that's generally not in Pennsylvania or probably West Virginia, but like in Texas, where I'm from, and other places, Australia, the amount of fresh water is a big issue. So this is kind of an example of how we're going through this process. So let's ask this next question, which is, if you're a policymaker, what would you want to know? So these are the options that are presented to you by two different groups. So one group is saying you should do one of the options, one is the other option, some say don't do anything. What would you want to know? What was that? Somebody said something? Cost, yes, cost, good. What else would you want to know? Yes.
It's going to piss off other people?
Yes, if it's going to irritate people, yes.
Does reducing the amount of freshwater use decrease output of the hydraulic fraction?
Right, so basically the impact, is it effective? Yes. Anything else?
I kind of want to know like how the mechanics of using the acid mine drainage for hydraulic fracturing.
Right, does it work? Does it not work? Yes. Okay, good. So you guys
Who
did.
might be other advocates for this?
I'm sorry, what?
Who might be other advocates?
Who might be other advocates? Yeah. Good, good. Anybody else? How sustainable the action will be? Yeah. Anything else? Yes?
If it will affect campaign donations.
If it'll affect campaign donations, good, good. How long take to implement? Good. Okay, anything else? Okay, you guys did an amazingly good job on this. Okay, so this is sort of a policymaker. So this I call the 4 E's. This is based on like real literature stuff, you know, but I have come to calling it the 4 E's just because I've been teaching policy analysis to engineers for a while, and it's easy for them to remember, plus engineer starts with an E. And so ease is very easy. So the first one is effectiveness, which you guys mentioned. Does it work? Okay. Is it, is whatever's proposed likely to work better than what we're doing now? If so, by how much? Next one is efficiency. What's the cost? So how much does the current policy cost? What is the cost of the proposed policy? So what's going to get the best bang for the societal buck? Equity. Who are the winners? Who are the losers? And then ease of political acceptability. This goes back to, the votes, right? In terms of the government officials, other policy actors, is there going to be too much opposition? Is there going to be too little support? What's going to happen there? So these 4 E's are sort of the key aspects that you need to know when you're proposing any sort of policy or any policy alternatives. You need to know the answer to these questions. What I typically find, and I used to find this a lot with, say, the PhD students that I used to work with, is people tend to focus on the first E, effectiveness, and they ignore the other 3. But as a policymaker, I have to look at all of these. I can't just look at whether or not it's effective. Because every once in a while I would see somebody, and I still remember like listening to this dissertation presentation, and it was about this like cable that would like run under the ocean to provide electricity to this island. And I said, how much does it cost? I don't know. Okay. Well, and this is to provide like wind energy to the island or from the island to the mainland or something like that. Well, the bottom line is if what you're proposing, that cost is more than the entire budget of the agency, then you know it's not going to work, right? I mean, it's just logical. So if you can't tell me even a behind the envelope calculation of how much it costs, then I'm not even going to consider it, because I need to know how much it costs relative to the current policy and how much it costs relative to the overall agency budget. Because if it's more, then it's not even worthwhile for me to propose it. And somebody somewhere in the policy process is going to say, how much does it cost? So any questions about the 4 E's?
I suppose the 4th one is a political facility. It's really a function of cost benefit analysis of the other boxes. Effectiveness, efficiency, cost benefit analysis, then political acceptability.
Not really the case, because there's plenty of things that people care about that are totally unrelated to cost.
So cost not only dollars, but cost society, cost.
Well, yeah, but it's more than that too, because just think about things that are moral issues. Like there's a lot of people who oppose issues just because they don't believe something. Something like, say, gay marriage. Doesn't cost anybody anything, right? But people still oppose it, right? So there's plenty of issues that people oppose on issues other than cost, but for cultural reasons, because people here's like, I'll give you another example. I was in I guess it was Arizona, Nevada, someplace like that. I was going around with the Hopi Guide, and I was really interesting to me because they had solar panels on all these, basically these almost hut kind of things. I was like impressed. I said, wow, cool, all these solar panels to provide, because it's on the top of a mesa, right, this big thing. I thought, well, that's a really good way to get electricity. And I said, you guys should have wind farms out here. They're like so cool. It would be, because you can imagine big wide plains. And they said, well, no, we don't want wind farms out here. And I said, why? Okay, well, it turns out that like 100 years ago, so you have this mesa here, and you have another mesa here. 100 years ago, on this mesa across from them, somebody decided to build a traditional church, like with a steeple and everything else. So they had to look at this, traditional Christian church all this time. This made them very upset. They don't want wind farms because it will hurt their vista. You hear the same thing in Massachusetts. They don't want wind farms in the ocean there because it'll hurt the vista of their ocean. So people care about issues beyond money. Then people like things. Some people don't like wind farms because they kill birds and bats. They don't want them near certain areas. So there's lots of different things. But continuing on here. So, but you are right in the sense of different things. So how do we measure these things? So there's lots of different ways. These are the ways I always do things. So effectiveness, what you want to do is look at program evaluation basically is looking at what has worked and not worked in the past. So this is not only what is, for the current policy, but you want to look at exemplar policies. Like if you're proposing, say, let's have electric vehicles at every parking lot on the West Virginia campus, okay? Well, one way, if you're going to make that proposal to the head of West Virginia University, is to find another university that does have solar panels, solar chargers throughout the campus, see how much it costs there, see how well it worked, see what challenges they had, so you can avoid those, right? So you can learn a lot by seeing what somebody else has done that's similar to what you're proposing. The next thing, as you said, benefit cost analysis, that is going to efficiency. So that's looking at how much it costs. Most, there are whole classes on how to do benefit cost analysis. So, but you can oftentimes find them out there or something very similar that you can use for your analysis. Or you can try to do it yourself. I would have students try to put them together. Equity, who are the key stakeholders, who wins, who loses. There's always winners, there's always losers. Maybe somebody doesn't like the electric vehicle stands because there's less handicap spaces or something, Ease of acceptability, for the people who are the stakeholders, what is their position, what is their power, and how high is that issue on their priority list? And that is used as something that's called Prince analysis. So here's a basic example of a simple pro-con activity. Again, this is from one of my students. So here's the criteria on this side. This is about lifting a ban on nuclear fuel reprocessing. Here's sort of a pro, here's sort of a con. So this is like the effectiveness, the technology has been proven effective over 40 years, but the problem is not all fuel can be disposed of that way. Or from efficiency, the funds currently cover the cost of transportation, but we're not sure how much it can be transported and so forth. So then they do these sort of final assessments. Positive means that is more likely to reach the goal. 0 means it's neutral, like the pluses and minuses sort of balance out, the pros and cons balance out. If it's negative, it means that it's less likely to reach the goal. So what you do is you do this for each of the different options. So for the status quo, option 1, option 2, and you put all this together so you can sort of see what you have. I picked this one primarily just so you could see like how color coding sort of helps. So if you were like a policymaker, if you're looking at a chart like this, which one would you pick? Option 1, right? Pretty easy to understand. Now, if I disagree with you, then I should say, well, I think, like, why don't you think it's effective to store fuel at the individual reactor site, which is actually really how we do it now. And they would have to explain why, right? So it gives a point of discussion. And it's something where you can easily explain to somebody why you think your option, the one that came up the highest, makes more sense than the other options. So your next exercise here, who are the stakeholders who might care about your policy? Who's likely to support and who's likely to oppose? So I want you to come up with 2 of each. Who's likely to support? Who's likely to oppose? Don't include government people, in other words, federal government people. You can include school boards, things of that nature. So who's going to volunteer their stakeholder list? Yes, okay.
Hang on.
So since mine was more specifically geared towards kids and school, like school-based intervention, I was going to say local communities and specifically parents. And along the same line of parents, like a PTA, school boards, and then on a larger macro level, like the Department of Health and Human Resources for the state.
Okay. So and I presume Health and Human Resources, like you don't have to say Department of Education as opposed to Health and Human Resources. Or,
We have a Department of Education as well.
so you would add them too?
And then specifically within the Department of Health and Human Resources, they have specific departments for health promotion, for like behavioral health and things, and public health and things like that.
So, so I'd say in general, you're not going to want to include the state departments primarily because they probably are not allowed to support or oppose a policy at all, right? So you would want to take them off your list.
Okay.
So then for your parents, I would suspect they might be divided, right? So who do you think would oppose? Like again, the goal here is to find 2 who oppose and 2 who support. So who do you think would oppose and who do you think would support?
So within a group of parents, there could be exceptions. So the intervention that we're proposing is school-wide, and there are parents who would be concerned that, well, my child doesn't display risky behaviors, therefore he's exempt from this. Or they would think that in addressing behavior such as substance abuse with kids, they might think it might make it look like their kid has a problem.
Right. Okay, good. Yeah, so, and who do you think would support it?
On the other hand, same parents that have a history with substance abuse that are concerned their children might fall into it. Also, I can imagine a lot of the local organizations that work with prevention and substance abuse could be in favor of it.
Yeah. So I think what you need to think about is organizations, right? So so when you look at the different like non-governmental organizations that are part of it, you know, so we're kind of getting it toward the end. That's a good group to focus on, right? Because what you want is to develop partnerships with the organizations that are likely to support whatever policy it is that you are thinking makes sense, and to get their input into it. Because they might say, again, I'll give another example. So this is a group of students I was working with. They were very interested in teens who were HIV positive. And they thought the problem was that these homeless teens couldn't afford the drugs. Turned out that wasn't the problem. But they only learned that after I brought somebody in who worked with these teens. And then they found out, well, there was plenty of money for the drugs. The problem was because they were homeless, these teens did not have they had no way to communicate with the teens. And so what would happen is they'd come in, they'd be diagnosed, they'd get the drugs, but there's no way they would stay on the drugs past that initial dosage. And there's no way to remind them to say, come in, you need more drugs, do that thing. So that's why it's good to work with those who could be your partners, because you can learn things like that you wouldn't know as a researcher, right? To work in partnership with those organizations. And then also understand the groups that would oppose it, because maybe you could modify your policy to make it more acceptable to them. Okay? Okay, anybody, how about anyone from this side?
I had sort of as I come over there, sort of kind of a piggyback or follow-up question. It was interesting in California, the group that opposed the legislation. So California passed legislation, you can't start high school earlier than 8:30 statewide. And teachers opposed it only because they didn't want to be told what to do. So it wasn't they were opposed to the actual policy. They didn't want to be told what to do. So have you suggestions for like that group as opposed, that they're not opposed to the actual policy, but they're opposed to you making a policy?
Well, you see, it's exactly what I was saying. they weren't consulted. That's the problem, is that whoever put together that policy decided to do it without consulting the teacher union and say, hey, we think it'd be a good idea to start high school at 8:30, which by the way, I totally agree with, right? Because you see all these studies. And they were, I would suspect that they were probably somebody who came out and they didn't consult what I'm talking about here. They didn't consult the people who are likely to support the policy or the ones who are likely to oppose the policy. If you don't, you need to create a village when you're trying to take action on anything, and they didn't create their village. And that's what led to their downfall. Right? Because they said, that's what teacher said, yeah, you didn't talk to us, you know? Well, maybe we would have said 8:45 is better, or, you know, we want to have a voice, we want to have input.
All right, so I think I need to start at the beginning with what my actions. So my actions were, what action should be taken by the National Institutes of Health of Environmental Sciences to monitor the effects of inactive ingredients in herbicides. And then, so you could do nothing. You could fund toxicological studies on commercial formulations. And the other option is to reduce the allowable levels of herbicides in food and water. And so my people who would be for would be food advocacy groups, maybe the public, and organic farmers. And the people who would be against would be conventional farmers, food manufacturers, and herbicide manufacturers.
Yeah, so the public is obviously way too vague,
okay.
Right? So just kind of keep that in mind. And I think you did hit someone on the head, is that it's really important to differentiate. Like a lot of people would just say industry, okay? But industry, there's like many parts of industry. Like I often object when people say oil and gas industry, because today it's really energy industry. Every major, like Shell, Exxon, Chevron, they're all big multinationals. And because there's so much pressure internationally to have different sources of energy, they're all in everything. So they're not in just oil and gas anymore. They have everything all over the world, right? So the same thing is probably true of the food guys, I suspect. That, like when you're talking about herbicide manufacturers, well, they're probably also doing things that advocate for organic food, or I don't know, some sort of clean herbicide version, or whatever, it might be. So I think what you'd want to do is try to understand that world a little bit better, and there's something called trade associations. Trade associations are where groups of companies get together and develop a common policy. So you're not dealing with like one company, you're dealing with a group of companies, and then it's much easier to deal with them when it comes to a particular policy. And I would kind of focus on those kinds of organizations, like the Organic Farmers Association, something like that. That's who you want to try to understand their position and how to work with them, and maybe meet with their people to kind of iron things out. Okay, overall good? Yes. Okay, one more. Anybody? Hey, somebody from over there. Okay, good. There you go.
So the thing that I was talking about was making a vaccine, right? So the people that I think are likely to support it would include healthcare providers, and potentially, I have written like the National Institute for Allergy and Infectious Disease, but that might be too high level. So I'm not really sure.
It's government, that's what it's called. Yes.
Yeah. And then my likely to oppose would be anti-vaxxers and potentially producers of antibiotics, because having a vaccine would prevent those antibiotics from being used.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So yeah, like I think you're getting the right thing. But again, try to identify when, like if you're doing research on this, identify the groups, because there's like a group for everything, right? Particularly in the medical world. Health professionals is too general, right? Because there's like, I don't know, today it seems to me like a million different kinds of health professionals. So you're going to have to go with one kind of health prevention. You're going to have to go with the AMA, or I don't know, maybe because the people who are most likely to give shots Like, I don't know who that is anymore, nurse practitioners. Yeah, whoever it is that it might be. Okay, well, let's move on so we can get through the communication section. So this is another example just to kind of give an idea. So this is, I think this person, they were doing, oh yeah, this is something related to a watershed, and I think actually in Ohio. So they were looking at the, and shale, it was a shale thing. They were looking at the industries that were upstream. Oh, no. They were looking at the part of the industries that were upstream, midstream, downstream. So upstream is like the hydraulic fracturing company, midstream is piping, downstream is chemical. They're looking at the advocacy groups in Ohio, government agencies, academia, the professional associations over there. And what they were trying to do is use this colorful tree. I think this is very imaginative. See, so it's basically the groups that were at the bottom, the groups in the trucks had the greatest influence. This was the watershed kind of organization. But I just put this here primarily just so you could see that you can make this colorful, interesting, attractive, not just a list of different things. This is something, this is part of what would be a Prince analysis, where, again, this is from the South Africa example I mentioned earlier, where you go and, like this case, this is their issue. So this is, say in this case, the South African government, when they do positive 3, that's their likelihood of favoring the policy. For industry, -2, they're likely to oppose the policy. This is like, I believe, on a -3 to +3 scale. Then here's environmental organizations, here's the public. We would try to do this as quantitative as possible based on, say, public polls when you were doing this. So it just kind of gives, you can figure out a sort of probability on this. So this is sort of like the policy steps that you would be doing before you talk to a policymaker about your research. And keep in mind that a lot of this is behind the scenes. In other words, it's not that you show all this work to a policymaker, but it's sort of the prep you need to do before you talk to a policymaker about your research. Because this is preparing you for the kinds of questions they're likely to ask. So if you say, we should protect the Beaver dams, okay, as you said, they're going to say, well, what about this? And you need to be able to answer that question, right? If they say, okay, well, I think there should be a PE teacher in every school. You say, well, great, that sounds good to me. I think kids should exercise more. How much would that cost? You need to be able to answer that question to have any impact, right? And by doing this, you're going to show the impact of your work and that you care that your research will have some, or could have some impact on decision making. You're trying to contribute to the social good. It's not just to enhance, your reputation, your university's reputation. You are trying to improve societal good and just societal decision making. So these are sort of the steps that we've gone through. If we had, like, I have all day tomorrow when I'm doing the same thing, but I only have 2 hours. So first, identifying your primary research finding that would likely be of interest to a policymaker, its policy implications. Look at the specific and research a specific policymaker and the jurisdiction relative to that issue. So make sure you understand, is it something where they can have an impact? Do your what actions, if any question, just so to make sure that you can separate out what is the question versus what is the answer. Don't put your answer in the question. Identify the status quo, 2 alternative options. When you have time, you can research this, so it's not just you coming up with something out of your head necessarily, but going, doing some online research, seeing what other people are proposing to solve the same problem. You're not alone in this. Using the 4 E's, you can draw upon often existing analysis, compare and prioritize the policy options, and then sort of summarize and communicate your results. So these are sort of the 7 steps of policy analysis. So now you try to need to tell your story. in 1 minute to the SNON expert. So this is the Starlight View. So I was with a major figure. Actually, I think Jake Cole told me that he came here one time. His name's Norm Augustine. And I spent a lot of time with him wandering, meeting with secretaries, cabinet secretaries, and members of Congress, talking about this report. And one time we went to a meeting, and it was with the chair of the House Education Workforce Committee. And it was an important meeting because a lot of the recommendations we had were related to education. And we were sitting here, and the member of Congress was sitting there, and right here, right next to him was a TV. And the TV showed the House floor. And we were supposed to meet with him for like 20 minutes. And instead he said, well, look, here's the deal. They just called a vote on the House floor. And you got 5 minutes, because I need to leave in 5 minutes to catch the train over to the Capitol so I can vote. Go. And so Norm Augustine, who was like a wizard at these kinds of things, he used to be CEO of Lockheed Martin, was able to get our spiel down that talked about what education policies we thought should be in place for STEM education. This is K through 12, as well as undergraduate and graduate education, and get it down. And he said, oh, great, that sounds great. Thank you. I'll definitely consider that. And poof, it's gone. And the entire time, Norm was watching the counter click down on the TV, because that's what they do. You know, if you ever watch C-SPAN or something, they click, 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 click. Okay. Sometimes you're going and you're literally walking into an elevator. This happened to me a lot when I was at the White House. And you finally caught this guy that you've been trying to connect with for forever. And you do, if you ever guys, you guys on that side, too young to watch West Wing. This guy side hopefully has ever watched West Wing. And you have to, literally, it's honestly the case, you do that walking and talking thing. Okay, Dr. Holter, here's the deal. This is you get into the elevator, you walk down, you go down the elevator with it, and you walk out to the car and say, oh, thank you. And you go back to security and go back up the building. So sometimes you really have to do it in 1 minute, whatever it is that you're trying to say. So when I go through, I'm going to go through these other things. I want you in 1 minute before we leave to tell me your story. Okay? I'm going to go through the rest of these while you think about your 1 minute. I'm going to time you for your 1 minute. Okay? Yes, very well. Have a good time in class. Okay, so here's some social aspects. Again, this is from this new recommended practice guide. I talked about some of these. I just want to emphasize them again. Establishing trust. You know, they'll know when you walk in the door if you're an advocate or not. Building the relationship, which means not talking to them always when you need something. Being respectful. One real challenge, like I used to, in my younger years, I was in a place called Beaumont, Texas. Are there any Texans in here? Probably not. Beaumont, Texas is like an hour east of Houston. And it's got the biggest refineries, chemical plants in the world. It's not known for its cultural highlights or whatever, but it had a very important university there called Lamar University. And nobody probably in the world other than this community in East Texas has heard of Lamar University. But they got this center for hazardous waste. But for that community, Lamar University was very important. It was the cultural center of that part of East Texas, right? And you just have to keep that in mind. So like if somebody from a Lamar University went to a major conference on hazardous waste management or whatever, probably nobody would think much of it, right? Because that's the way university land is. But in their part of the world and to their member of Congress, okay, Lamar University is very important. And that's why they got that Center for Hazardous Waste Management, right? So be respectful, right? Don't, it's not their level of respect is not the same thing. In other words, your levels, the degree to which you respect somebody is not the same as if it is in university land. So just kind of keep it in mind. Like another way to think about this is if all of a sudden one of you said, okay, the president of West Virginia says, okay, I want you to go work for this West Virginia legislator for 6 months because they really need something. They really are into beaver dams and they want you to go work there. Go there. Wouldn't you be kind of lost, right? I mean, you don't even know where, you know, like what? I've never even been there, right? The same thing happens to the policymaker when you start talking about your research, okay? So it's really important to treat them respectfully, realize they have their own data, knowledge base, which is public policy. You have your knowledge base. They will always be respectful of you. You should always be respectful of them. Remember, science is only one input. I talked about other inputs which are not science related. So keep that in mind. Cultural issues, lots of different things. Be productive. Don't think about their positions on 500 million issues. Focus on just your issue. Good evidence and emotional stories. Okay. When you guys all started at the beginning, I said, give me something, right? Something that I can relate to. Somebody with schizophrenia, something that I can understand, right? Because I'll remember the story. I'm not going to remember all your gobbledygook, right? And the story is something I might be able to use in a speech, or I might be able to use when I'm talking to another member of Congress, okay? So think, add some sort of story that they're going to remember. Another example, mistakes. Okay, so one time, somebody from UC Irvine, they contacted me. They always were contacting me and bugging me. And one time they said, okay, well, here's this person. He's a major professor. He chaired this major committee at the Department of Energy. He wants to talk to the people at Office on Technology Policy. I said, okay, I think this is legit. I will see if I'll talk to you. Okay, so I got him an hour to talk about this report about energy stuff. So in this 1 hour, okay, and I had there the head of the director of the office, I had the policy guru who really made things happen, and he talked. He spent a half hour saying why it was important to do something about energy and climate change. Okay. Now, there was absolutely no need for him to spend a half hour telling these people who were already experts on energy and climate change and already knew all this stuff, that message, right? Because they already knew it. So he wasted a half hour. And do you know what happened? Those big wigs that had started the meeting, they were gone in 15 minutes. They didn't stay. They had better things to do than somebody tell them what they already knew. Okay? On the other hand, one time I wrote a speech for Norma Augustine, the guy I met earlier, and I went and had this beautiful this congressional testimony about how important it was to do these recommendations and so on and so forth, and he totally changed it. And he went, and out of the 5 pages, which is a 5-minute testimony, he spent 4 pages convincing them there was a problem and only 1 page on the recommendations. Why? Because it was a different audience. And that audience needed to be convinced there was a problem. And they didn't need to hear the recommendations. They needed to be convinced there was a problem. So think about your audience and what it is that they need to know. These are other sort of mistakes. Since we're running out of time, we're going to keep on going here. These are different things. I think pick your battles. Don't think the evidence speaks for itself. I'll just tell you one quick story about this. Is that one time, I was testifying in the Texas state legislature. This is about container deposit legislation. So this is when you buy a Coke, you pay an extra nickel, and then when you put the Coke can back, you get a nickel back. Okay, so I was very impressed with myself. I did this 1-page document, all the facts as to how it works and everything of my 4 E's and how great it was. This is the conversations that I had. So the first member of the Texas state legislature I met with, he says, well, little lady, here's the deal. If people don't throw those Coke cans on the side of the road, then what are the Boy Scouts going to do? They're going to pick up, they don't have any cans to pick up, and how are they going to fund their activities? That was person 1. Then I went and at the actual hearing, Coca-Cola bus, like 40, 50 people from their Coca-Cola bottling plant in Dallas to Austin and brought them in the hearing room and said, look, all these people will lose their jobs if this container deposit legislation passes. So despite the fact that the majority of Texans approved container deposit legislation, and I had all the facts about how it worked in Washington and Oregon and everything else, I was beat out by Coca-Cola and the Boy Scouts. Just saying. Don't think the evidence speaks for itself. Here's other things. Making policies really difficult. No policy is perfect. Policymakers are experts too. Not all policymakers are the same. Starting policies from scratch is very rarely an option. That's why you have to do the status quo. There's something out there already. Public opinion matters. There's more to policy than scientific evidence. And policy and politics are not the same thing. Different kinds of things. I like this. This is from Steinberg. Okay, that's it. I went the 1 minute. Let me see, I got 5 minutes left, so you're really going to have like 30 seconds. I'm going to sit here. I'm with my little watch. We're going to start here. Hold on.
Well, I have no idea. Can I ask a question instead?
Okay, okay, well, you have 30 seconds to ask the question, but then I means I'd be really fast on my answers.
How do you even get, like, say I wanted to get access to a policymaker to talk to them. How do I even get access to them?
Okay, do you want to speak to them on your own behalf or on your research or for the university?
That's a good question.
If it's a university, you go through your federal relations person, okay? And they will sort of work with you to figure out what makes sense. If you're a person, send an email, write a letter, make a phone call, know who your member of Congress is, know who your representatives are.
Do they even act? Because I do that all the time. And I feel like they don't actually pay attention to that.
Do you ever follow up?
How do you follow up? Just send another email or make another call?
Yes. You call and I actually have to talk to somebody.
Okay.
It's got to be relevant to what they're doing. If you're just calling to say like, I want you to vote Y on issue X, that's not a discussion item, right?
Okay. How do you get access if you do want to talk about your specific research?
Then you work through your federal relations person. Yeah, because it's going to really depend on. They'll have to work through to figure out who's the right person and where. And it's got to be relevant to like what's going on. Or it might be, just also think about your disciplinary societies, because there's always, they all have like days in Washington, that kind of thing, that you can use. And then their group settings. Also, almost all of them have open house kinds of days. So they'll have like every Tuesday at 9 o'clock, you can go and have like breakfast with your senator. So they usually will, like on their webpage, they'll say when that happens, and that's a good way to do it too. And those time you actually meet with actual representative, or they'll have town halls that are in your town. Like, have you ever tried to actually meet representative at their own town halls that are here?
Well, my specific representative that I wanted to contact, he doesn't do town halls.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, someone like that, right? And you know what happened for my district? They started protesting outside his offices because they didn't do any communication. So we better move on. Okay. I guess that's it. You can ask a question, or you can give me your 1 minute spiel, or actually 30-second spiel.
So I work on herbicides like Roundup, and it's heavily used, and there's a lot of conflicting information in the news about whether it causes cancer. And so I'm working on understanding the effects of glyphosate in the commercial formulations. I'm also not sure what we're supposed to be doing. Sorry.
I have been studying how the impact of climate change on water in the West will result in much drier late summers, and how installing fake beaver dams can induce beavers to come back, and how all those beaver dams that they will build will help bring water back to the later summer.
So nearly 100 Americans suffer from neurological disorders, and they are hard to treat because the serotonin system targets nearly every brain region. Every person is individual, so they respond differently. And so my research is focused on understanding how these serotonin systems are being regulated in a simpler model system. Fruit flies.
Better than the beginning.
So I think, I mean, one thing that it shows is just it's practice, right? So that we're not used to not talking amongst ourselves. And so it's just a lot of practice and rewriting. And so it's just a different type of speaking and writing.
No, I think that's very true. You know, and that's why I like when I teach classes, I have them present almost every week, right? And do blogs and things like that, because the more you practice, the better you'll get at it.
Ellen Alda started an entire institute of science communication. And so like there's whole like programs you can go to. So it's not that anybody should feel like you needed to be an expert today or
Right.
by the end of
This is the introduction. I'll add the American Geophysical Union does probably one of the best communicating science stuff around, and they do workshops and things like that. Yes, go ahead.
I study a bacteria that causes severe antibiotic-resistant infections, and we need a vaccine, so we need to have funding for that vaccine to be made.
Okay.
I study space exploration artifacts. It is absolutely essential to preserve them because they contain the original material which serves as base to develop new space exploration missions.
Okay, good.
So in the state of West Virginia, our children are exposed to a lot of disparities, which can cause a lot of behavioral or cause a lot of issues with them in adulthood. So we would like to evaluate and assess these factors in both their lives and in school to help help schools and families and state agencies provide the appropriate interventions to help break the cycle of disease.
So I'm opting out and asking a question. When you say summarize and communicate your results, what are the best platforms? Is it this 1-minute summary story? Is it the colorful analysis?
It's going to differ depending on your audience. And yeah, so there's so many different ways to do it. But the bottom line is you need the basis. You know, it's kind of like, you know, you need your theme song. And that theme song then becomes the basis for whatever it is that you end up doing from then on. That's why I say 1 minute, because, you know, it might be responding, you know, even in Twitter to something that somebody does online and it gets picked up. It might be, you know, the basis of a video, might, you know, or a letter or anything else. So it's going to vary an awful lot depending on what it is. So that's like a whole nother spiel. You know.
So you're coming back when?
I study a drinking water pathogen called Legionella that causes pneumonia. And one thing that I've seen in my research is that it's often, I should also add that it likes to grow in building plumbing. And one thing I've seen in my research is that homeowners and building managers don't know how to control this pathogen. And so one policy option would be for the EPA to establish guidance that would help homeowners and building managers to work with utilities to maintain water quality in their building plumbing.
Okay, you're very close. Like too many this, tell this, tell this, tell this. Yeah. But if you work with a policy person, you could get it to work. Okay, so that's it. Unless you want to say, do you want to say something?
Just want to thank you.
Thank
everybody for the audience. And we have unlimited numbers of follow stickers, as Joan well knows. And so if you want to take as many as you want today, but also if you have student groups or that you would love to hand these out to, let me know and we can get you like as many as you would want.
Give them to your friends and neighbors.
But thank you.
Thank you very much.